Hello, everyone. My name is Tvisha Martin. I'm happy to be guest lecturing for your lab this week. I am a current PhD student at The Ohio State University within Dr. Christine Sprunger's Rhizosphere Dynamics lab. And I am here today to talk to you a little bit about nematodes and the role they play in the soil food web. So first off, let's start by talking about the importance of the soil food web. The soil food web provides essential ecosystem services such as organic matter decomposition, nutrient conversion of these large organic matter pieces that come into the soil food web environment and need to be broken down. And nutrients need to be almost extracted from those organic matter pieces, mineralized and converted into a source of nutrients for plant uptake. The soil food web also plays an important role in carbon storage, as well as it is a food supply for above ground macrofauna, as the below ground soil food web is highly interconnected to above ground macroorganisms. So let's take a little bit more of a deeper dive into this. So when we talk about the soil food web, we can kind of think of it all starting with, for example, plants, and it's circular and it connects back to plants. But if we start with plants, it all starts with the shoots and roots of these plants, which provide organic matter. And this organic matter is the form of waste, residue, and metabolites from plants and animals. And then after organic matter, bacteria and fungi start to try to break down that organic matter. And then after that, what feeds on the fungi and bacteria are sometimes nematodes that are fungal and bacterial feeders, protozoa such as amoebas, flagellates, and ciliates also feed on that bacteria, fungi. And then what feeds on the nematodes are other nematodes, which are these predators. There are arthropods such as mites, which shred and digest either plant material or also that fungi. And then there are larger arthropods that feed on those smaller arthropods. And then what feeds on the arthropods are those above ground macrofauna, kind of what I was referencing, which are those birds and animals. And then also I forgot to mention that there are these nematodes also that just feed on the plants, which are your parasitic nematodes. So nematodes are extremely important because they actually are located in several parts of that soil food web, because there are strategists. So kind of defining our strategists a little bit are like these organisms that reproduce a lot. So that, for example, if you take the oyster, there's 500 million in a year. They have really short life cycles. They don't give a lot in terms of taking care of their offspring. And it's on this gradient all the way up to these really heavy K strategists, which reproduce maybe one every 5 years. They give a lot of time and energy into their offspring. And so nematodes can function as both R and K strategists, which makes them really special in terms of the soil food web, as they're really one of the only below ground soil microbe that is capable of functioning as either an R and K strategist. So let's talk a little bit more about the nematodes as R strategists. So R strategist nematodes can take the form of bacterivores. So they are primarily bacterial feeders. They respond to organic matter inputs that are easily broken down. And they are really responsible for this carbon and nitrogen cycling and the breakdown of organic matter, and then making that carbon and nitrogen into something that the plants can then take up. Nematodes can also take the form of fungivores. So fungivores are fungal feeders. They are also really responsible for carbon and nitrogen mineralization, and they can function as both those R strategists or K strategists. Additionally, nematodes can be predators, and these predators feed on our strategist nematodes, and they also control the populations of our strategist nematodes, which is kind of called top-down soil food web control. And they are these case strategists that reproduce not very much throughout a year. They take care of their offspring. They're also typically larger nematodes, and they're actually really sensitive to disturbance within a soil environment. Additionally, there are omnivore nematodes, which are these non-plant parasitic plant feeders, and they're also case strategists. And lastly, we have these plant parasitic nematodes that we kind of referenced before in this lecture. And these nematodes are plant root feeders, and they're primarily our strategists. So looking at kind of the physiology of these nematodes and these different nematodes within these different groups, the bacterial feeders are commonly seen with no stylet or spear. So when I talk about the stylet, it's this protrusion at the top of the mouth, and it kind of looks just like this point that will usually be coming out of the mouth, and then that's usually how they actually feed. So bacterial feeders have no teeth or stylet. Fungal feeders, seen here, do have that stylet. And then plant feeders actually have a spear with knobs at the base. And essentially when I talk about a spear, what this is basically it's this feeding appendage that kind of goes all pretty long throughout the oesophagus, and it protrudes to then essentially like almost like stabbing its prey. And so the plant feeder has a spear with knobs, and then the predator are most commonly identified because predators always have these teeth, and that's how they actually feed on these other nematodes. And then lastly, we have omnivores, which also have a spear, but these spear does not have the knobs like the plant feeder usually does. So we kind of talked about, nematodes and their feeding groups, their feeding preferences, what type of nematodes are in case strategists, and their importance in the soil food web, where they're located in the soil food web. But then we ask, why do we care? So nematodes are very essential for carbon and nitrogen cycling. Nematodes cycle approximately around 30% of the nitrogen in soil, and they convert it into ammonium right here. And so this is very important for plant uptake, as ammonium is one of the available forms of nitrogen that plants can then uptake and then be able to produce. And nematodes are extremely essential for carbon sequestration, as they essentially will mineralize carbon, and they're actually found in aggregates. And so when they mineralize that carbon is then stored within these aggregates. And essentially, nematodes are active within the soil profile. So as nematodes move and they're simultaneously cycling these nutrients of carbon and nitrogen, they will transport this carbon and nitrogen throughout the soil profile. So for example, here we have a picture of this plant growing, and we have these bacteria and fungi, which are fed on by bacteriivores, fungivores, and omnivores. And then, so essentially this bacteria and fungi, right, are breaking down soil organic matter and the fresh organic matter. And then we have the herbivores, which are also take the form of nematodes, are breaking down like these plant roots and providing exudates. So this is kind of just a summary of how essentially these bacterivore, fungivore, and omnivore nematodes primarily are playing this really important in nutrient mineralization. And that all starts with the breakdown of organic matter. So then nematodes can also serve as indicators of soil food web health. They're extremely sensitive to disturbance and change. So if you have a system that is heavily disturbed, you're typically going to see nematode community with less of those K strategists and more of those R strategists, because K strategists are super sensitive to changes in the environment. Nematode abundances also fluctuate with their food source. So if you have a really high amount of nitrogen containing organic matter coming into a system, you're going to see a huge influx of bacteria. So therefore a huge influx of bacteriivores because they're feeding on that bacteria. Whereas if you have a certain piece of organic matter that's like really hard to decompose, you're going to see more fungi decomposing, you know, a more recalcitrant piece of organic matter. And then those abundance of fungi are going to create a more abundance of fungivores than opposed to bacteriivores. So they really fluctuate with their food source, and it's a great way to be able to infer how decomposition is happening within the soil food web in a particular system. And as I said, they are R and K strategists, so they can infer the soil food web structure. They can also indicate plant parasitism, and that's commonly what they're used for because nematodes also take the form of plant parasites. And they're also easier to quantify than genomic quantification of the microbiome. It's a lot easier to look at nematodes and identify. It's still very labor intensive, but it's a lot easier and cheaper than to go and sequence an entire microbiome and infer soil food web health through that channel. So just to kind of go back and look at how nematodes can infer different soil food web systems, this is a picture that depicts soil food webs in an agricultural system, all the way to more of a stable system, or one that's less disturbed, of a late successional system. So I just wanted to kind of point out the differences of how, you know, you see these organic matter materials coming in, and then you have like this bacterial channel, and then maybe a fungal channel, but you don't really see any predators. And then if we go all the way up to a late successional system, which has more of a diverse input of plant inputs, you have more fungi, you have maybe perennial plants giving in this organic matter, and that in turn causes nematodes to be more interconnected and more K strategists. For example, here you still have like a bacterial and fungal channel, but you see this interconnectedness with predators then, and an overall more developed soil food web. And because nematodes play a primary role in this, we can infer then what is happening within these soil food webs when we're comparing between an agricultural system and a late successional system. So in summary from this lecture, I would really like you guys to be able to take away that the soil food web is essential for maintaining ecosystem services, like we talked about for carbon and nitrogen cycling and carbon storage. Nematodes are really the only below ground soil organism to be both R and K strategists, which makes them such a great indicator of soil food web health. And then to kind of reiterate, they're specialized into these different feeding groups. And so those feeding groups are bacteriivores, which feed on bacteria, fungivores, which feed on fungi, predator and omnivores, which feed on other nematodes, and plant parasitic nematodes. And then they can also indicate soil food web health because they play such an immediate role in organic matter decomposition and are highly regulated by their food sources. So I wanted to thank you guys so much for listening. Again, I am a PhD student in Dr. Christine Sprunger's lab. I included kind of our link to the lab website if you guys are more interested in our work. And also if you guys have any questions, feel free to contact me. I have my email provided right there. And to thank you guys so much for listening.